Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Community Development, Housing, and General Government Committee meeting. One of our council members, committee members, again, like yesterday, is not here with us due to work restraints, but we have the other three members of the committee. We have a very short agenda compared to last month in August when we came back after the break. And I told the council that's what happens. We have the long August agenda, and then from that point on, the agendas get shorter and shorter depending on what staff brings us. We have one consent item, and we have three general government items. And if I could get a motion from the committee to accept the consent agenda, then we can move on to the general.
So moved.
Second.
It's been moved and properly seconded that we accept the consent agenda. All those in favor, let it be known by voting yes. All those opposed, no. And the motion passes. If the secretary will go ahead and read the first general agenda item.
Item G1, resolution regarding the eligibility of Evergreen Farm for the National Register of Historic Places located in the Southwest Ward.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair, members of the committee, and council members. I'm Heather Bratland, a Historic Resources Officer, and I'm here to bring forward the review for the nomination of Evergreen Farm. In front of you, you will see a map of Evergreen Farm with the resources marked on it. It's an 88-acre farmstead in the southwest portion of Forsyth County, partially in the county, partially in the city of Winston-Salem. This is a photo of the farmhouse dated 1896. These are photos of some of the outbuildings in the house yard and in the farmyard. And these are some photos of the outlying lands, the woodlands, and the farm fields. This is a photograph of the farm circa 1907 that was taken by James Monroe Jarvis. This farm was his creation. He took and developed these photographs on his own, and the period of significance for the farm is from the time of his acquisition in 1894 until his death in 1947. The Historic Resources Commission at their most recent meeting unanimously voted to determine that this farmstead is eligible for listing in the National Register under Criterion A for events associated with the development of modernized agriculture in Forsyth County, B for its association with Plowboy Jarvis, and D for its archaeological potential. And it also met the integrity test. So their recommendation, a unanimous recommendation, is that this property be listed in the National Register.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any questions or comments? Councilmember Beth.
I just got out of a briefing with staff on some of the complications involved in the case here. You'll have seen that there is a letter of concern from the State Secretary of Transportation. As I understand it, the upshot is that this property is in the path of one of the links of the proposed Northern Beltway. Interestingly, it is the last link, both on the southwest end and if I recall correctly, it is the only link that the Transportation Advisory Committee did not recommend as a funding priority. Mm-hmm. However, it was later placed in the funding priority plan by NCDOT. There seems to be no real question that the property itself has archaeological potential that should be reviewed and considered. However, NCDOT, as I understand it, is concerned about potential implications for the timing of this link of the Beltway construction. It is my understanding, and we have the District 9 engineer here who can correct me if any of my understandings are wrong. It's Pat Ivey, and I would ask, please do if I'm mistaken. But it is my understanding that even if there were some reviews required by the archaeological potential of the property, that the added review requirements would affect only this link and not affect any other segment of the Beltway. Is that?
Mr. Ivy, would you come forward, please? State your name and...
Pat Ivy, NCDOT Division Engineer, Division 9. As I understand it, the Secretary Trogdon's concern when he wrote the initial letter was the fact that we didn't have a lot of time to do any analysis on this before it was to be considered by the statewide group. Our historical architectural group in Raleigh has had an opportunity to review this initially. We do have a meeting with the Federal Highway Administration next week. However, we have had these issues come up before, and their opinion is that this being designated as a on the National Register would not create an issue that would prevent the project from moving forward. We would have some additional work that we would need to do, potential mitigation. We deal with that on every project, so we do not see this as a fatal flaw that would create a problem for that section of the Beltway.
That seems to answer the complication that had been brought up.
Yes.
Is that? Thank you.
Yes, sir.
In that case, it certainly appears to be meritorious for archaeological study for the potential resources there, and I would move that we recommend approval.
Thank you. Second.
Second.
Thank you, Pat.
Yeah.
Can I ask a quick question, Stan?
Yes. Councilman McIntyre.
Heather, can you just outline to us and to the public what this designation means? What's the impact of this, other than there's a federal...
Sure. National Register designation is primarily an honor for a private property owner. It does make you eligible for certain federal tax incentives for qualified rehabilitation projects and qualified conservation contributions, such as easements. For the DOT or for any federal undertaking, it does mean that those historic resources will be considered, the impact of a federal undertaking will be considered on the historic resources. So, for example, if it's designated, there are federal funds that will be used with the Beltway project, so it means the feds will come in and say, how can we lessen the impact on these historic resources? How can we mitigate that?
This action by itself, though, if we approve it, has no financial consequences to the current owner unless they spend a significant amount of money.
Correct, or make a qualified conservation contribution or donate an easement.
Right. So we're not granting them any financial...
And there's no tax impact to the city whatsoever in terms of tax impact.
It's more carrot than stick. We'd
Correct.
like you to do good things with it.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's been moved and properly seconded. All those in favor, let it be known by voting yes. All those opposed, please vote no. And the motion passes. Thank you. Next item, please.
Item G2, resolution adopting the Peters Creek Parkway Growth Corridor Plan. This item was continued from the August Community Development Housing General Government Committee.
And Councilmember Bessie, if I recall, you had some concerns.
Yes. The concern that I had potentially was that the language regarding a very small section of the area reviewed in the plan, and that's West 4th Street between Salem Parkway and well, it says Academy Street, but I think actually they're talking about Peters Creek. Might lead to a potential misreading of the section and be argued to suggest that the plan encourages reconsidering whether to change the usage from residential. Met with staff, and staff has drafted language that would clarify that that is not the intent of the plan. It would recommend that if that is reconsidered, restudied in the future, that it only take place if the planning board and the city council both determine that it should be reviewed, so that it would not encourage either explicitly or implicitly the planning board deciding on its own that it wanted to take this up and reconsider whether residential usage was the way. And, the language is indicated at the bottom of the sheet that was passed around with the underscored and strikeout. It's pretty simple. It says this plan does not recommend that the land use at this location be changed. However, if the planning board and city council determine that the proposed land use recommendations for this area need to be reevaluated in the future, this plan recommends examining this site using a dedicated process where all interested parties could collaborate on a potential redevelopment alternative for the site. It strikes out a sentence reference to the planning board alone proposing such a study, and says such a process would not take place unless directed by the planning board and city council. And with that clarification, I would be happy to recommend approval.
Thank you. That's a motion.
That's a motion.
Second.
It's been moved and properly seconded that we accept the resolution on the area plan. All those in favor, let it be known by voting yes. All those opposed, no, and the motion passes. Next item, please.
Item G3, resolution to change the name of the city fair to the Twin City Classic Fair.
Mr. Rao.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair, members of the City Council.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Last month, on August 19th, the City Council adopted a resolution to change the name of the Dixie Classic Fair of Northwest North Carolina. In addition, Council also adopted a resolution directing staff to develop a process to come up with a new name. Over the last few weeks, City Management, along with staff from the fairgrounds and our marketing department, have reviewed the list of suggestions that were submitted during the public input process that was conducted in April and May, and came up with a short list of potential names. And that list consists of the Carolina Classic Fair, Carolina Agri-Classic Fair, and the Classic Fair. City Manager and I had individual conversations with elected officials to hear their preferences about one of the potential names, and also about the effective date of the name change. And based on those discussions, the resolution that is before you today recommends changing the name to the Twin City Classic Fair, and that name change would be effective with the 2020 fair. So that is the action before you this afternoon. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Rao. Councilmember Cynthia.
Mr. Rao, is there a time sensitivity to this name change?
Typically, we start to promote the upcoming year's fair at the conclusion of the current year fair, and so our plan, is to proceed with that. But I think that we could obviously adjust our schedule and our preparations.
Councilmember Bessie.
Yes, I was thinking that we do have two separate questions involved in the review today. One, and probably the simpler one, is whether we want to make explicit that we intend for whatever change that we approve to be effective for the 2020 fair. And the other is a question of selection. I would suggest that we bifurcate the review process, consider whether we want to make that explicit recommendation to the council that the name change be effective for 2020, and then come back and discuss the naming alternatives. Because just from sort of informal one-on-one conversations, I get the strong impression that there's still no consensus on the council about which name to recommend. If appropriate, Madam Chair, I would make a motion that we split the discussion today and take up first the question of whether we want to make the change effective for 2020. And if that's appropriate, I would make a motion that we recommend to the full council that we adopt a resolution saying that we intend for the change to be effective in 2020. And the reason I do that is because I don't see any advantage to Winston-Salem or anyone else for us to drag the process out over a longer period. I am strongly of the opinion that we ought to stop kicking the can down the road and make a decision and make it effective. So I would make the motion, if it's in order, that we recommend first, that we recommend to the council that we make any name change effective in 2020. I guess I'll...
And do we have a second? A second. It has been moved and properly seconded that we recommend, the substitute motion is, or the motion is, that we recommend to the council that whatever actions take place to change the name for 2020, effective 2020. All those in favor, let it be known by voting yes.
Yep.
Discussion.
Discussion.
Yes, ma'am.
If we pass this recommendation, then it says we're going to immediately seek to change the name for 2020. That's what we're saying regardless, so which means we don't have time to consider other possibilities or information that might affect that name. Is that the intent of this motion, that if that's the case, then we vote today on the recommended name change?
Well, it doesn't necessarily say that we have to vote today on a recommended name change. We could retain that second part in committee for later consideration, and recognizing that if we do that, then we are postponing the normal marketing process for the fair for next year until there's a new name. I personally favor acting without additional delay, and I'll tell you why. The opinion that I get from my constituents is pretty clear on one point, and they keep saying, don't you have other more important things you need to be spending your time on? And their answer is yes, we have other things we need to spend the time on. This is a powerful symbolic issue on which, honestly, we are never going to get a public consensus. We have gotten a lot of input, both from our constituents in Winston-Salem and from all across the country. 14 states, I think, had comments submitted from 14 states, including folks in Hawaii. I'm not sure why anyone in Hawaii is invested in the issue of what Winston-Salem's fair should be named, but I think that it's time for us to not pass the buck, not kick the can down the road, and make a decision. However, if we vote to recommend now that the council conclusively say we're going to have the decision take effect in 2020, we're not necessarily going to be voting as a committee today, because I don't know if there's a majority to do that, to recommend a name. So this is one question. Then the question of whether we recommend selecting a name now is another one.
All right.
Mr. Rao, excuse me.
Go right ahead, Councilmember.
If our timeline is for 2020, what is the drop-dead date that we will need to have a name by?
Well, we began to promote the fair with national organizations, probably towards the end of this calendar year. So, I mean, really probably early 2020 at the latest.
So I know the Chamber's doing a great study on how to market Winston-Salem, and I think their deadline is to have information back at the end of December or near the end of the year, which might give us some insights into trying to tie a total city image together with the fair. So are you saying that if we wanted to change the name in 2020 for that fair, we could go up to maybe the end of the year to get that information on possible image?
I think we can make that work.
Okay.
Councilmember McIntosh.
I'm still a little fuzzy on exactly what the intent is of the bifurcation.
If I may?
Councilmember Best.
The intent is to make clear that we are not going to delay. We're simply not going to delay. Whatever decision we make, we're going to make in an expeditious fashion, and we want it to go into effect 2020. I think that it is counterproductive to the city's best interest to drag out this symbolic fight for another year, and we ought to make a decision now and have it go into effect next year.
Does your motion have a timeline on it? Have a deadline?
No, the motion that I made, the initial motion, is simply that we recommend that the council say we're going to make a decision effective for the 2020 fair, and that's what we're doing.
And excuse me, and that, to Councilmember Bessie, that does not necessarily mean that we're going to delay it till whatever.
Okay,
We're saying that we'll make the recommendation to the council, and it'll be up to council to decide as a whole when they want to do this. It could be January, it could be February, it could be December. The process. Councilmember.
I wanted to answer one of Ms.
Councilmember Scipio.
Scipio's questions. I don't think we should advocate this, and I think we could get good feedback from the study that the Chamber's going to be doing, but we've already kind of kicked it over to somebody else once and didn't follow their recommendations. I think council needs to do this, and if we have time, if it comes back in time for us to make that, that's great, but I wouldn't want to delay it waiting for that process to finish.
Thank you, Councilmember McIntosh. Councilmember Larson.
Yes, my impression was that we'd ask staff to come back with a program to answer the basic questions of the name and what have you. And what we came back with, instead of a process, we've come back with a very specific one recommendation for one name. And that wasn't quite what I expected to see. And now my colleague, Mr. Bessie, is now coming forward with, in fact, a program. I see it as 3 parts instead of 2. I see we have to determine a date. We have to determine, I think, a name, and then we have to determine actually an implementation schedule on that, which nobody has really comprehended yet. And I would like us to think, if we're trying to prioritize this, it seems like the first thing we have to decide on is the name. The name will dictate then the date, the availability of the date, and the implementation schedule. I would like to see staff give us an idea of what implementation involves in the sense of cost and time to do this, so that we can have some reasonable schedule as to what our schedule requirements are for determining a name. And I'd also like to have more than one option, that is, for looking at on the proposal for the name change. I'm not, come on record, I'm not happy with the name that they've come forward with. So I'm not a member of this committee, and I will not obviously be voting on this, but I do not favor this name, and I don't particularly favor the process that we've undergone to get to this point. But if we're going to follow Mr. Bessie's recommendation, and I can see the advantages of trying to break this into smaller bites to comprehend it, I would recommend that the first thing we do is determine the name and go ahead and get that resolved, whatever has to be done to do that.
Thank you. Councilmember Best.
I understand my colleague's desire to be orderly and methodical. I think as a practical matter, though, the toughest part is going to be settling on a name, because we have 8 members of the council and probably 8 different opinions. And at some point, we're going to have to cut bait and pick one. But I think the thing that we need to resolve is our fundamental time frame first. Does this go into effect next year? And I feel very strongly that we need to stop dragging it out and just make a decision.
Can I ask a question of staff? May I ask a question?
Councilmember Larson.
Yeah, that's a question of staff. If we have any consultation with the Fairgrounds Committee, I assume they'll be the ones who will ultimately be responsible for the implementation, the changing of the branding, the logoing, the fonts, whatever else has to be done to recreate the new. Who's going to actually oversee that process of this transition from one name to another? Have we any idea as to what is involved in all of that, to the point that we know one, the budget, but more importantly, the timetable, it sounds like, to allow this to happen.
Councilmember Larson, staff would work closely with the Fair Planning Committee and the Public Assembly Facilities Commission on the development of an implementation plan, which would include the development of a new logo, new marketing plan, reviewing of an appropriate budget to cover these transition costs. We have not done that at this point, but certainly as far as the next step after approval of a name and establishing when it would be effective, we would involve those two appointed boards.
I think what we're trying to find out here is what the framework of time periods we have to make these decisions. And for me, it seems like I kind of need to know what the drop dead date is and the cost of what we're doing when we actually say, oh, it's going to be Twin City Fair. What does that mean in the sense of implementation? And Councilmember Bessie saying, we've decided that it's going to be 2020 come, heck or high water. But what I want to know is that reasonable for implementation? I mean, I just need to know that. We're putting that burden on somebody, and I'm assuming it's going to be on staff and Fairgrounds Committee, but I haven't heard anything in the plan for implementation that I thought we were going to get of how we were going to make this transition. Part of that transition is actually making the transition. And I'd sort of like to understand what the scope of that is and what time is going to be required to do that.
Councilmember Larson.
Yes, ma'am.
Excuse me, are you finished? Because I want to make a comment.
Well, if somebody can answer that, I'd love to.
Well, maybe nobody can answer that today to your liking, Councilmember, but this is just, to get to the chase, as I call it. It may seem like we are moving too fast or that all the questions haven't been answered. We'll never be able to really answer all the questions to the likings of 8 people and to 2 committees. It just won't happen. We may get to a point where we can find some win-win to this. But I am sure Mr. Rao, as the other members of the committee will tell you, only thing we're doing today, we're trying to settle on that we go forward in knowing that we're going to a recommendation to the council. That's still 8 people and a mayor, as you know, that can vote in a tie vote. It may be on Monday that the council, 5, decide they don't want to go further with this. It's a committee recommendation. It's not, to me, the end of the world. It's just part of the process to move us along, really. But I am quite sure, Mr. Rao knows in my conversations with he and the city manager, that whatever happens this week, today, next week, if we vote to go ahead and say 2020, then they will come forward. And if the next vote that one of the committee members may recommend is that we hold up off the name because maybe we're not happy with the name and we go back to that part of it. But it gives us another opportunity to spend a little bit more time on that. And once he has his marching orders to put the implementational plan in place, it will come back to this committee and it will come back to the council and the committee, and the council will have an opportunity to weigh in on, just like when they present area plans and everything else. We will get a chance firsthand to see what the people that are working on it want to do. That's the 2 committees and the staff and marketing. That's another piece. That's 4. As to what the logo will look like, once we've established what the name is, what the cost will be. Again, people keep thinking that this money comes out of the general budget, and it doesn't. The fair has a fund, just like other things, transportation, bus station. They are self-sufficient, really, in a way. But that's where we are with that. We're not going to solve all the problems here today and answer all the questions, but the committee, again, all we're doing is going forward to make a recommendation to the council. And it'll be up to the council on Monday to vote 4-4, 5-4, 2-4, whatever. That's democracy.
7-1.
Okay?
7-1.
And it could be that. And at the end of the day, whatever it is, well, I'm hoping that all of us are resolved in accepting whatever the outcome is on Monday. Any other questions? Councilmember Bessie, you had your hand.
Just a brief comment. One of the things that keeps getting raised is the cost. And in the process, there are some wildly inflated figures that are thrown around by folks who fundamentally oppose any change in the name. The only cost is going to be repainting some signs, changing a couple of the signs over the entrances, and changing, printing new stationery. Each year, the fair remarkets the fair.
Every year.
As long as we don't delay past when that marketing has to start in what we tell them to include as the name, there's no extra marketing costs required. Someone made a recommendation that the city undertake a major additional marketing campaign to sell the fact that we were changing the new name. That is not part of the routine process. This council as a whole would have to approve any such authorization, and I will say once again that I will shriek no to that kind of unnecessary expenditure. So as long as we don't delay our decision past the regular marketing schedule for the fair, the additional costs will be modest.
Okay.
May I
Councilmember Larson.
respond to that? I think transparency in this operation is paramount at this point, whether it be costs or schedules. I think also the order and process in which we proceed in making these decisions be clear to the public. And I think there's been a lot of confusion, obviously, about cost and name and what have you. And what I was trying to suggest is that the order in which we make these decisions will impact on the subsequent decisions that have to be made. The name has to be decided before we have a schedule as to when we're going to implement. And I think from the purposes of planning, we should have an idea what those costs are, and the public should know what those costs are, to remove the rumors that you say are out there, and I agree, are out there. But we're only going to address those if we do the study, which is part of the process, which I thought we were trying to achieve. We will proceed, and we need to get on with it. I agree.
Thank you. Councilmember Larson, well noted, all of your concerns and points. Call for the motion. All of those in favor, please say so by voting yes, and all those opposed vote no. The motion passes, and that motion is that we, Councilman Bessie, would you restate the motion for the record, please?
That the council determined formally that we intend for the name change that we select to be effective for the 2020 fair.
Thank you. All right, and this resolution on the name change, do we have another motion as to where we go with this, or do we just we let it die for the time being?
For the time being, I am prepared to go with my colleagues in saying we can hold it in committee and come up with a recommendation on the specific name. I'm hoping in October, but that would still be in time for us to include this as a part of the regular marketing costs. I mean, I have a recommendation, but it's one of the names that the council was polled on. I agree that Twin City Classic is not the best choice because of the risk that it could narrow the perceived scope of the fair. I appreciate staff's honest effort to come up with what could be a good recommendation, and it's not their fault that they don't have a magic wand here.
Amen. Thank you. We're going to hold that in committee. Mr. Garrity,
and
City Attorney.
Chairman
Yes.
Adams, I would suggest too that next month we can bring back the holding committee. Now that we know it's, assuming it passes Monday night, that to be effective 2020, we can bring back that detailed plan as far as implementation, but we will still seek guidance from you on the name, on the actual name.
Thank you. Again, we want to thank staff. We want to thank the Fair Committee, the Facilities Committee, Marketing, and all of the people that have been involved in this process, as well as the citizens of Winston-Salem and all the adjoining counties and others that have been a part of the fair forever and will continue to be a part of it. Again, it's not pretty, people, but this is how democracy works. Sometimes we end up twirling our fingers and going over the same thing over and over again, trying to hopefully come to some resolve that we'll all find a win-win somewhere. But as you've heard me say for years, over a decade, that it's not Burger King. Everybody's not going to get what they want. But if we all can just, be happy with, I got my pickles because I like pickles. You got your ketchup because you like ketchup. You got your onions because you like onions. But at the end of the day, we're okay. We'll be okay. We'll be okay. Our city will continue to thrive and be made whole. But, there'll be more discussion on this, Councilmember Larson, McIntosh, Bessie, and Scipio, and others to come. But at the end of the day, we're just hoping that whatever name we land on, that it encompasses the whole Piedmont region of this county and the counties that surround us and have supported this fair for decades. Okay? At the end of that, I had one person that signed up for commentary. Would the committee be willing to, since we have time? Okay, Mr. Kirkman, Roger Kirkman. Thank you.
That's for the chair. I'm not walking around at the same time.
Go ahead and give us your name and address, please.
All right. My name is Roger Kirkman. I live at 2550 Bidding Road here in Winston-Salem. I'd like to first apologize for my lamentable part in continuing to beat this subject to death. But I've got something to say about it. And I think we need to have a win-win situation, and this is certainly not it. That's the subject of my piece here. Winston-Salem may not be thought of as a world city, but is certainly singular. Neither port nor capital, our city has its distinction in its industrious citizens. As a Moravian settlement, it expressed itself in work, as worship, duty, even as virtue. With these values, despite shortcomings at times, Winston-Salem and its region has been a dynamo for the South in many ways. Decades ago, Fortune magazine published its first Fortune 100 in the South edition. It had 3 triad companies in it as its top companies, including the #1 position. Winston-Salem also achieves high marks in Best Cities list, even on worldwide criteria. I was looking at the other day, it was sitting right next at number 35 to Karachi. I have no idea why. It may have become also the first city in the United States and maybe even the world to achieve black-white parity in wages. I think that's a very significant step. However, its reach is not just in capital. Our city has a substantial hinterland that people don't often think about. Cultural historians find jars produced by 18th century Moravian potters as far away as Virginia and Tennessee. The Below House from the 1830s, it was the shopping mall of its day. It attracted customers from the edge of settlement in the West. For many years, the Winston-Salem Journal news racks could be found as far away as Bluefield, West Virginia. So it's an immense area that this city represents and serves. There's no need to itemize here the geographic reach of Reynolds, Haynes, and many other local enterprises. We all know about that. This vision also expressed itself in the Dixie Classic Fair, a fair not of just one county. It has served the Northwest and is in the same attendance class as many state fairs, those of Florida, Nebraska, Missouri, Oregon, Virginia, and Kansas among them. At times, it is ranked as one of the top 50 fairs in the entire country. Now, the fair appropriated for itself an incredibly grandiose title to claim an expanse that reached essentially from Washington, D.C. to Houston, Texas. I'm pretty sure that's what they had in mind, and I think they probably went too far. However, its names association long brought discomfort to a significant number of our fellow citizens, and that's what we'll talk about today. Your speaker saw firsthand the beginnings of change as a clarinetist in the East Forsyth Marching Band in the 1960s.
Excuse me, Mr. Bidding, you might want to wind up. You only really got like 3 minutes.
Okay.
Okay.
Recently, Winston-Salem committed itself anew to leaving a political... Dan knows a lot about what I'm like. Recently, Winston-Salem committed itself anew to leaving a polemical past by mitigating the presence of a Confederate monument. This is something that I think in the future, if not now, will prove to be a real feather in the cap of this council that they've done it. A similar experience spirit animates the current move to rename the fair. However, it's not in the spirit of our region to reduce the fair's name to something that could have been dreamed up in Lilliput. Adopting Queen City Classic Fair as a substitute excludes not only the entire Northwest, a map of which is part of the fair's seal, but diminishes itself further by leaving out the county it is in. Neither is the name unique. Not only are there other twin cities in the world, there are also tri-cities and quad cities. They're all over the place. There's nothing unique about this name. I'm going to try to keep going faster.
You got about 30 seconds.
Okay. I'm going to go to Morgan Freeman, who popularized, even if he did not originate, what should be our watchword, go big or go home. Many other names on the list are suggested to point the way. None as grandiose as the previous name, but are better suited for a fair in a class of many state fairs. Our choice should derive from creative thinking on a broad canvas. The scope of the fair could actually be reinvigorated or expanded. The Chitwood thrill shows remain a favorite part of many childhoods here. After all, Winston-Salem is the birthplace of NASCAR. You could have legacy races. Subject areas like sciences sections, I've been thinking about battle bots, or innovation and invention area could have their places. Not only do many know the first practical cigarette making machines were developed here, but few know that the modular phone plug was actually invented in Forsyth County. The first fair similar to this kind of fair was held in Greensboro in the 1820s, 1828. It evidenced no bias in exhibiting patented hat-making devices alongside giant 12-inch turnips. There are many other avenues, some of which may prove unachievable. Our fair should be a place where everyone is welcome, expansive, not diminishing, and world-class and singular. Thanks for listening to me.
Thank you, Mr. Biddy. All right. Any other issues by the committee or concerns to bring forward? This meeting is adjourned. Thank you very much, everyone.